Okay, let's talk about this deal. Because if I'm being honest with you guys, we talked about how the last deal, when we saw it, it had improved from what the Trump administration was asking for, which was $500 billion worth of mineral wealth, which, number one, we don't even have proof that Ukraine has that much mineral wealth. And number two, Ukraine was sent, if we're being generous, about $110 billion worth of aid. If you take away, for example, the investments that were made in the United States to American companies that are now no longer going to be sending artillery shells over anyway. So you can't count, you know, a gift to expand production if the production is not used to help Ukraine as aid to Ukraine. You could call it a giveaway to an American defense company to expand production, but it is not aid to Ukraine. So let's say $110 billion, if we're, again, being generous, and they're asking for $500 billion worth of mineral value. Doesn't really seem like a fair deal, especially since the United States never informed Ukraine when giving them the aid that this was coming with a price tag and was not within both countries' interests and a fulfillment of its previously made commitments. And then making that price tag that you didn't know existed in the first place have a 300 to 400% price tag higher than what you were given. It did not create friends in Kiev. That's what that proposal did. It did not create friends in Kiev. And so Kiev stood strong, and it created tension. And you could see the MAGA base get outraged at the fact that this country that they just called a proxy would not actually act like a proxy and just do what Washington said when it told Ukraine to dance. Zelensky didn't just dance. He said, well, here are our interests. And if this country is going to be rebuilding and you're going to expect even a return on investment in the future in the own place or a stable country or a future for Ukraine, then they're going to have to be able to rebuild. And to be able to rebuild, they're going to have to be able to profit off of what is within their borders. And that includes their mineral wealth. That doesn't mean that they're the only ones that need to profit from the mineral wealth, but they do need to be the primary recipients of profit in order to make sure that they can rebuild their nation and recover from the scars placed upon them by their brother nation, as the Russians would refer to themselves. Very abusive brother. Either way, they needed the recipient of that profit. And so eventually they negotiated something a little different, which was that there was going to be a private institution that would have American and Ukrainian representatives on it that would choose and pick where the money from these profits would come from. And it would include, you know, infrastructure projects and stuff in Ukraine to help benefit the nation state. So it seemed like a joint venture by the American government and the Ukrainian government in order to improve Ukraine's economic standing. That was the new proposal. Now, a lot of the specifics had not been clearly combed and figured out, but then after the Oval Office blow up, no agreement was signed. And it all kind of fell to the wayside. Well, Zelensky made very clear that he was willing to pay ball. He agreed to the 30-day ceasefires the Russians refused to agree to. He agreed to the long-range energy ceasefire that the Russians then added new terms to. He agreed to the Black Sea ceasefire that the Russians then added new terms to. He's agreed to basically every ceasefire before the Russians then deny that ceasefire, kick the can down the road, and say, well, what about this new term, right? With the most recent terms being some of the most ridiculous, and we'll talk about that at the end of this segment. But they go through all of this process, and then eventually the Ukrainian governments and the American governments come together again and have a new mineral deal because Donald Trump still wants to reciprocate the United States for the aid given. Now, of course, it's the made-up number of his head of $350 billion, which is not real. But he said it enough times that his base thinks it's real and he needs to reciprocate that aid. And so they have a new deal. And this deal might just be worse than the last one. And I know that's saying a lot, but there's some stuff in here about the type of access that the American government would have to the Ukrainian government that is astonishing. And no other government on the planet has agreed to that or would agree to that and stay very popular for long. Listen to this. The U.S. is pushing for a sweeping new deal to to control Ukraine's critical minerals and energy assets while offering Kiev no security guarantees in return and an aggressive expansion of its previous demands. The new draft deal sent to Kiev on Sunday and seen by the Financial Times goes well beyond an initial joint accord hammered out last month as part of the U.S. President Donald Trump's effort to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine and recoup billions of dollars worth of military assistance. Senior Ukrainian officials said the proposal could undermine their nation's sovereignty, route profits abroad, and deepen its dependence on Washington. The draft deal marks a drastic escalation of the Trump administration's effort to seize control of Ukraine's lucrative natural resources as it presses to bring the conflict to an end. It would apply to all mineral resources, everything, from cobalt to aluminum to copper to anything, including oil and gas and major energy assets across the entire Ukrainian territory. Oil, gas, cobalt, any rare earth metals, everything. Washington is demanding that Ukraine and the United States set up a supervisory board to oversee a joint investment fund to split the income for Ukraine's oil, gas, and mineral projects between the two countries. So this would mean that the way it would work is that the United States and Ukraine owns all of Ukraine's resources. That this no longer becomes Ukraine and like the Ukrainian government's resources where the Americans have made investments and are reaping some of the profits. No. This becomes all of Ukraine's natural resources is co-owned by the United States. Co-owned. Again, Ukraine needs profits to rebuild itself if it ever hopes to survive going into the 21st century. The U.S. would appoint 3 of the 5 board members, giving Washington full veto power over the fund. What this would mean is that it wouldn't be Ukraine, and it's already ridiculous enough, Ukraine and America's resources, which is what the deal sounded like and already didn't sound good. No, this would be America and Ukraine's economic resources, with America getting first and final say on what happens to investments, on what happens to their oil, on what happens to their gas, on what happens to their rare earth metals, on what happens to their mines, on what happens to their land, and what happens to the people who work in those mines, what happens to the people who work in those gas facilities, who work in those oil facilities, who transport that fuel, and where that goes, and who are the primary beneficiaries of that profit. This is colonial. This is colonial. That's what this is. You can call it neo-colonial if you want to make yourself feel a little better about it. But what we're doing is, while Ukraine is being invaded by a modern expansionist empire who doesn't believe they even have a right to exist, we're taking advantage of the situation where Ukraine made itself more vulnerable, in part for our own security in the 90s, and then assisted us in Iraq, provided aid to the United States in advance of certain, after certain disasters. And now, after all of that trust being placed in us and us saying we would stand with them till the end, we're now taking the situation to have Russia control and hold the Ukrainian territory that it has, with even private discussions being reported going on between the Russian government and the American government about what happens to those resources, while at the same time, the American government is getting complete control, near complete control. 3 out of the 5 board members are going to be American. They would get first and final say. They would be, from Trump's perspective, as the businessman, hey, you guys wanted a businessman, congratulations. This is the problem with choosing con men, snake oil salesmen, grubby businessmen to run the country like a business. Then they do. Then they run this country like a business, and they treat other countries like a business. And that means profit over people. That means profit over people. And nations are made up of people, not dollar signs. Dollar signs matter to people, but they should only matter as so far as they can help people. But he doesn't think that way. He thinks about this as an investment. And this is a divide and conquer strategy. This is, what country on the planet has this agreement with another nation? Does any country on the planet have this agreement with another nation? Belarus doesn't have this agreement with the Russians. Belarus doesn't. There's a lot of Russian control of Belarusian industry. Even this is more aggressive. This is more aggressive than some of the strong arming than what the Russians tried to do to the Ukrainians back in the day, which was evil in its own right, or at least coercive, if we want to take moral language out of it. By the way, this isn't it. This is just the beginning. There's more. The draft also says that the contributions of the United States following the full-scale Russian invasion of 2022 would be deemed as contributions to the partnership. So you want to know what that means? Ukraine contributes. America already did. America already did. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told Fox News on Wednesday he believed the deal could be signed as soon as next week. But 3 senior Ukrainian officials told the Financial Times that was unlikely to happen. But the thing is, the Trump administration has been so braggadocious and so bold with his predictions. Trump said the war was going to end before he got into office. And then after he said that during the debates, then it was 24 hours. And then it became 100 days. What is it going to be after 100 days, guys? Because guess what? It's not going to make 100 days. We're fast approaching 100 days of the Trump presidency. It's like right around the corner, man. And we don't see the war's end in sight. So what happens after 100 days? What happens after he violated his deadlines 3 times in a row? So, I mean, like for me, them saying, oh, it's going to be next week, and then it doesn't happen, that will just be another deadline or another bold, braggadocious prediction that, you know, ended up falling flat. Snake oil. A third official said a team of legal advisors have been brought in to help the government examine the document as it prepared a counteroffer. And remember, these guys, if they ask questions in public, if Zelensky says it, like goes in public and says, hey, you know, the Russians violated all these agreements last time, or hey, don't you think we should be the primary recipients of our own nation's wealth? If they say that type of stuff in public, that's insulting. That's mean. Why are you being so rude to Trump? Why aren't you saying thank you? Have you said thank you to our Lord and Savior this morning, Donald Trump? Ukrainians have expressed frustration at the increasing pressure from the Trump team to compromise to secure a ceasefire and lasting peace, even as the Kremlin shows no sign of stopping its invasion. In Paris on Thursday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the U.S. was constantly changing the terms of the agreement, but he added that he did not want Washington to think Kiev was against the deal. The Trump administration's new proposal would supersede the previous framework agreement on jointly developing Ukraine's mineral resources agreed last month by Kiev and Washington. That deal, which have established a fund, we already talked about that. And by the way, that deal was already bad. It was talking about 50% of future profits from mineral resources. You know, it's still not a great deal, but it's somehow better than this one. Under the new proposal, projects covered by the fund would include those carried out by the Ukrainian government itself, as well as by companies approved by Kiev or state-owned organizations. The deal also covers infrastructure connected to the exploitation of natural resources, such as roads, railways, pipelines, ports, and processing plants. So if you just thought, oh, America would just own, you know, America would just have, you know, control over, well, the deposits themselves, and that's really bad, but I mean, no. Roads, railways, pipelines, ports, and processing plants. America does not fight for Ukraine's coast, is willing to give up 80% of it, if not more under certain conditions, in order to please the Russians and make peace so he can feel better about himself. And the few ports that Ukraine still has, well, don't you think America deserves its cut? Don't you think Uncle Sam deserves its slice of the pie? Why is anti-Americanism skyrocketing in Europe, guys? Where was this peace through strength? Where's the strength? And where is the respect that I was going to see America deem itself on the world stage? Where is that respect? Because I don't see it. I don't see it. And this is not how you get people to respect you. This is how you get nations and people to despise you. The deal also covers infrastructure. Already read that. funds generated under the latest proposal would be converted directly into foreign currency and routed abroad, and Ukraine would be liable for compensation in the event of delays or disputes. Funds generated would be converted directly into foreign currency and routed abroad. The U.S. would receive royalties from the fund before Ukraine. Before Ukraine. America gets its money before the Ukrainians do on its mineral profits at a 4% premium, and would retain priority rights on infrastructure projects, as well as veto power over third-party sales of resources. Meaning that if Ukraine wanted to sell some of its resources to Poland, or if Ukraine wanted to sell some of its resources to Lithuania, the American government gets first say. If they say no, then that's it. While the deal does not include provisions for U.S. ownership of Ukraine's nuclear power infrastructure, a controversial idea floated last week by Trump. He wants everything. Ukrainian officials remain wary that nuclear assets could still be on the table in future negotiations. One official familiar with the matter said the nuclear issue had been raised in earlier discussions, but was deliberately excluded from this iteration of the proposal. The U.S. State Department did not immediately respond to a request for comment. A Treasury spokesperson said of the expanded offer, the United States remains committed to quick conclusions of vital agreements and to securing a lasting peace for both Ukraine and Russia. So for them, strong-arming Ukraine is just part of the deal. It's just part of the process. Ukraine got the short end of the stick, and so it needs to pay the big boys, America and Russia, for the cost of bothering us with them sacrificing their nuclear arsenal to us and bleeding on our television screens. And let me just say, and I know me saying that it gets worse is hard to believe, but I do have to say that it does get worse. And I do need to highlight something that Yaroslav Timirov, who wrote a fantastic book called The War That Came to Us, that I really think you guys should read. One of the best books on the war. I really do believe that. He found something that was in the deal. This clause right here would allow the U.S. government to inspect the files of every government and private entity in Ukraine. This is some Big Brother nonsense. This is some authoritarian Big Brother. This is the type of stuff that conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones said that like FEMA wanted to like come to America and do. They're gonna take over our government. They're gonna put the strings. Remember that proxy Victoria Nuland like theories that you would hear all the time? That's what they want. That's what they want here. They want to create a rump state that they control and know everything about. And let me just throw out there that a government that is having a really embarrassing leaking scandal where they can't even keep the journalists out of the Signal chat groups where they're discussing times for airstrikes in Yemen, giving that government, which had the Jack Textera leak to that leaked casualty data and other stuff about the war, to have to give them every single file from your government. So, and if you read this thing, it says for them to make copies of, it's not just they come in and they can examine it. They want copies of every single Ukrainian government file filed in Washington. That means the Ukrainian government writes something, they copy it, send it to the United States, they copy it and put it in a file. Ukraine can't have secrets from the United States. Ukraine's government is our government to look in and peer upon because we gave them $110 billion worth of aid that we said came with no strings attached, except for a small section that they already agreed to pay back in loans for, because we believed it was within both of our security interests and we wanted to uphold our own credibility. But now that we have Trump in there, every single agreement we've ever signed can be null and voided in an instant. American credibility does not matter. Us representing ourselves to have any like basic moral decency and values, and us to not kick a guy while he's down. Donald Trump's diplomatic negotiating philosophy is if he sees a man walking down the street, have a tire iron slammed into the back of his neck as he goes down, and the man in a ski mask pulls his wallet out of his pocket. As the man's dazed and looking around for help, Donald Trump's philosophy is that guy is probably still out of it enough for me to get his wedding ring off of his fucking finger. That seems to be the negotiating policy right now. It's not, how can we strengthen the Ukrainian position in negotiations so we can get terms that would be amenable enough for everyday people so that they would be willing to make sacrifices that otherwise they should never have to make, but might have to because the alternative is worse. I.e., we'll see if we can get some of this land back so we can end it with a security arrangement where another invasion doesn't happen and where the Russians feel like they can at least, like something. I still wouldn't be super excited. A lot of people wouldn't be super excited with that outcome, but there would be some strategy to make it so that both sides didn't get everything they wanted, but they got enough to make it palatable so they could swallow. This is making it so foul and rotten that they can't even hold it near their nose, let alone swallow it. This is the way the mafia behaves. This is the worst traits of the United States and United States business culture and our worst historical tendencies and habits coming out in its ugliest manner and its most blunt manner, and being paired with diplomatic incompetency, where the Russians can use old KGB diplomatic negotiating tactics with ease and getting tricked again and again and again. Molotov's old tactic of just restating the position allowed Steve Witkoff to be pushed back and back and back to the point where he sounds like he's speaking Russian today. He's speaking like the Russians on RT, and the Russians on RT are speaking like the worst, like the worst. I mean, on their like Russier One news channels are speaking like the worst war bloggers online. Because what's happening is, as they use these old KGB tactics, as they announce a ceasefire and then the Russians say, wait a second, I got these new terms, and then America shifts, and then they announce a new ceasefire, and the Russian says, hey, wait a minute, we got some new terms, and then they shift again. And this is all going on, and this is all failing. The Russians, I think, are more braggadocious and more bold than ever. I think what's going to happen, and it's not even I think what's going to happen, I know what's going to happen, is that as Trump concedes, the Russians are going to push for more. And we're already seeing that right now. You want to know what just happened? What Putin just proposed as we were going live today? This is being reported by the Financial Times. This is from a correspondent that covers the area, Anastasia Stogoni. Putin has proposed, and this was today, just like a few hours ago, Putin has proposed a temporary administration in Ukraine under the auspices of the UN to hold democratic elections and bring power to a capable government that has the trust of the people, and only then start peace negotiations. Trump said he had a plan to end the war before his office. Then it was 24 hours. Now it's 100 days. This is not 100 days. We're going to miss that deadline easy. Easy. But Trump is still basing his hopes and his dreams on a boat with a million holes in it. But maybe that boat doesn't matter when it comes to the future of Ukrainian peace or the Ukrainian nation if he's in a totally separate boat entirely, which is, I'm not in the Ukraine boat because I don't care. That's how he can treat them, just like he can treat it like a venture capitalist, where if it goes wrong and we mismanage it and it all goes defunct, don't worry, we can gut it and take the resources anyway. Hell, if Trump's willing to be this aggressive when it comes to Ukrainian profits and Ukraine's resource rights and sovereignty, here's a question. Let's say a war does start again. What's the easier move for this presidency? Moving in and defending Ukraine because, oh, their investments are at risk? Or making a deal with the Russians for them to just get the same deal on the profits, but with them once they control Ukraine? How do you think the Russians would perceive this about what is in America's interests when it comes to the Ukrainians? Our toughest negotiating that's going on is either against them to get them to come to the table, which didn't matter anyway because the Russians didn't want to, and then trying to see what we can bleed out of this rock instead of seeing what pressure we can place on the Ukrainians. And I was listening to Keir Starmer today. I was listening to Emmanuel Macron as they were having this meeting of the Coalition of the Willing. Don't know if it was the best choice of name.
Putin has donated $5. I promise I won't violate a ceasefire this time.
Oh, well, that's reassuring. Well, that's good to know. That's reassuring. Thank you, Vladimir Putin. I appreciate the $5 American. Okay, I don't know how you got through the SWIFT sanctions to make that transaction, but I do appreciate the moolah. Thank you. Trump has given a lot. He's already given a mile, and so Putin has taken 10. It's not an inch and take a mile. This is Trump has given a mile, and so Putin has decided to take half the Atlantic. Okay, this is not a strategy for success. And let's talk about all the ways that this can go. Let's talk about all the different pathways here, because none of them, you want to know how none of these pathways end? Good. None of these pathways end. The pathway that Putin is now offering Trump, if he walks through those glistening gates, is a pathway to failure on any level if you care about the future of European peace or the future of Ukraine. Let's be optimistic. Let's start with optimism, okay? Optimistically, let's say that this succeeds, and Putin might actually somewhat be serious about at least temporarily stopping the fire. Well, this would have to be done on terms that I assume, since Trump has yet to show any public pressure on the Russians, that would be towards what is being discussed around, the ending of aid to Ukraine, or at least the holding of these democratic elections. This is probably going to take months to organize. And Trump and Putin has yet to agree to any across-the-line ceasefire. So that means the best case scenario, even if this goes well, this would probably take months. And what is what is Putin going to do in those months? He's going to continue to attack. He's going to continue to advance while demanding that aid stop in order to facilitate peace. AKA, he'll still take in North Korean bombs. He'll still send in more and more North Korean soldiers, which that is expanding. I think recent reports indicate like 11,000 troops. Wouldn't be surprised if we see them invading deeper and deeper into Europe soon as they cross the border into Ukraine. I wouldn't be surprised. And in this period, in this time frame, the Russians are going to add pressure, and they're going to use this dragging out of the peace process to continue their offensives. They're going to drag their feet. And that is best case scenario, is at the end of that, we actually do have some version of a peace. Maybe it will be the peace where Ukraine gets to hold on to what it still holds on to. Maybe it'll be the peace where Trump tries to force upon them, giving up Kherson and Zaporizhia, which Ukraine will not do willingly, which would mean a collapse of the peace, which then brings us to, even though that's still a bad deal and bad circumstances, because you're allowing the Russians to get a better position for negotiations by letting them drag it out. Let's go into the worst scenarios. Let's say that Donald Trump entertains this philosophy, entertains this idea of elections, and makes the Ukrainians do it. Now, there's two ways you can go about it. Number one, the Ukrainians say no, and then they blame the Ukrainians for it, cut off all the aid, and say, it's your problem now. We're reopening with the Russians, removing sanctions, and then the Russians will be able to expand drone production, shell production. They'll get American CNC machines, will then manufacture the parts necessary to bomb Ukrainian cities. That is a really bad scenario. Another bad scenario is not that Ukraine immediately says no to this idea of, you need to accept this election. Let's say they say yes, and they actually have to go do the election. Well, what happens if Zelensky gets elected again? What if he runs again and you have the same government? Well, then you're back to square one. And the Russians who said, that they'll only be willing to, do an election if they have one that trusts the people. They're never going to say Zelensky trusts the people. We'll be back at square one, and then nothing will have changed. And the only difference is now there's more people dead, less aid to Ukraine, and the Russians probably have advanced some. So that would be a failure. Okay, let's say that somebody else gets elected, somebody that's more peaceful than Zelensky, willing to concede more. Well, okay, there's no appetite in Ukraine to concede Kherson and Zaporizhia. So if that's the type of concessions that the Russians are demanding, which reports indicate, then that still might not even be enough even if you get somebody that is more conciliatory, because at the end of the day, he might have to face down the Americans, he might have to face down the Russians, but the Ukrainians will tie his ass to a pole if he sells out their freedom. I'm not saying that if he makes a hard deal that was necessary, but if he sells them down the river, they feel that way. Like the Ukrainian people have shown themselves to be quite aggressive towards political leadership. I'm not saying that's exactly how it would go down with the pole tying or whatever. I'm just saying that he might have to take the Yanukovych shuffle out of the country. So there's, and let's say that, I mean, like even if we have one of the best case scenarios in the area where this is just dragging to the feet, and this wakes up America's fervor, and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe he wasn't serious. I guess we're finally going to support Ukraine, which, good luck, okay? Living on a prayer, that's what you're doing. Even if that's the case, that means we just wasted months. Months of shipments, months we could have helped the Ukrainians prepare, months that the Russians used to prepare, months of a lack of aggressive sanctions enforcement, because it's not just a question about placing the sanctions, it's a question about enforcing the sanctions. I mean, Trump came in with this statement of we're going to sanction the Russians if they don't come to peace. And after him saying all this shindig, all this business about 24 hours, and now we're going past 100 days, and he's entertaining the idea of sanctions relief for the Russians, not even for a full frontline ceasefire, but just for a Black Sea and energy ceasefire, which in many ways benefits them more than the Ukrainians. Is this the art of the deal I have heard so much about? Is this the diplomatic acumen that the MAGA movement oohs and ahs about? Is this the type of stuff that has any number of commentators on the PBD, Tim Pool, or Joe Rogan experiences head over heels? Is this golden age of peace that I heard about, where now we have the 2,000-pound bombs dropping on Gaza? That war is still going on. We still have the war going in Ukraine. We're no more peaceful. If anything, all I've heard is the possibility of America starting new conflicts with new nations, not reeling back the conflicts that are going on in the world right now. Donald Trump went in with no plan, and this is the best he can manage against this seasoned KGB veteran. This is the moment where you should take it like this isn't serious. This isn't serious. This isn't serious. This is a delaying tactic. And if you're curious as to what the delaying tactic could be for, well, it could be that the Russians want to invade Sumy or Kharkiv again, like they have in the past. The Russians tried to invade into Kharkiv in the Volchansk offensive. I was on that front. I was on the Lipsy front as well, in the Kharkiv region. They invaded to try to get a hold back in the region, tried to either divide up the Ukrainian army, put more strain on it in more places, and or take more land. And you know what you could do if you're the Russians? If you do an invasion of Sumy or do invasion of Kharkiv, then you can take enough land and then say, if you ever want this land back, then you have to give us Kherson. You have to give us Zaporizhia. If not, then we're going to divide your other regions as well. So basically, if they can get that land after, pressure and other factors had the Ukrainians pull out of Kursk, the Russians could essentially try to do what the Ukrainians did with Kursk, but with Sumy and Kharkiv. And so Zelensky is warning that Russia's gearing up for new offensives on these regions. And I remember when I was filming my documentary about, this exact possibility, I didn't really know how much I believed that the Russians would really dedicate those much resources to a whole new offensive to take the region. But given the current conditions, I think they're in a much better position to do it now than they would have before. In a much better position to do it now than they would have before. Where before, to invade Sumy, before dealing with Kursk, which was a political humiliation for the Russians, would have been extremely difficult. But now with the Ukrainians largely out of Kursk, even though they still hold some of the border areas, that could free them to try to do these more bodacious operations to try to put more pressure on the Ukrainians. Now, the Ukrainians are trying to prepare for this. I saw that they had a crossing in Belgorod in order to try to make it so the Russians have to deal with that and distract them there instead of invading Sumy. And this could be Zelensky talking. It is a possibility that There's just a certain amount of smoke being blown. But I would say that the likelihood that the Russians are at least considering something like this, or at least planning these operations, I think is high. They still have shown every intention of taking the Kherson region. You can see it from the way they treat the locals and they bomb the people. You can see it from the way that they talk. And crossing the Dnieper River would be a military disaster. It's just going to cost a lot of lives. It's going to cost a lot of personnel. It's going to cost a lot of equipment. And even without American support, it's going to be a difficult operation to conduct successfully. So, Sumy and Kharkiv have an interconnected highway system with Russia. A lot easier to try to break the defenses there than support a river crossing. At least that could be the philosophy behind trying to invade Sumy and Kharkiv to try to complete the conquering of the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, which Russia has already announced the annexation of, embarrassingly, before they took the regions. But, I mean, it could be a method of trying to show how dedicated they are to the region in the negotiations, which that seems to be the tactic. Either way, there's the real threat of future Russian invasions. And so this peace deal might not just blow up, or this peace negotiation process might just not blow up in the Americans' face and embarrass Trump, if there's not proper support for Ukraine provided to prepare for this externality, which, considering Russia's record, is more than a possibility. Then this is going to blow up in the face of the residents of the Kharkiv and Sumy region more than it already does through the drones that attack them throughout the week. Okay, any questions?